The Civil War increased the intensity of the cult of domesticity in the southern states during the threat of secession. This increase had already begun to occur during industrialization and the market revolution in northern states, where men began to work for wages in factories and women stayed home to care for the home in turn. Even very poor women who had to work in factories alongside their husbands worked in the making of typically domestic items such as clothing and soap. This movement towards domesticity in the workplace increased its value, as well as clearly defining the domestic sphere as a separate entity in the complete control of women. Through these changes, the idea of women's morality versus men's rationality came into being. When the Civil War took place, women became nurses in the war. In this instance, women were bringing domesticity into the lives of men, therefore increasing its value and further defining the two spheres. This increase in the value of women's domestic work furthered the idea that women were innately care providers and nurturers.
Reform movements put forth and advocated for by women were backed by this morality factor that women presumably possessed. As you can see in this temperance movement poster, the poised young lady on the left is guiding the man away from the temptations of alcohol, portrayed on the right by giving him water. The Victorian fashion, as seen on the left, was a direct result of pushes for separate male and female identity, exaggerating body differences. In a way, women were silenced, but were given a voice for issues that had anything to do with morality. While men were supposedly physically and intellectually superior, women were supposedly morally superior, and therefore could talk about reform movements from their position. Reform movements were not seen in the South, except for temperance, but there was still a godly idea of a woman in the home. Catherine Beecher, an American educator, wrote in her essay Treatise on Domestic Economy in 1841, "In civil and political affairs, American women take no interest or concern, except so far as they sympathize with their family and personal friends. But in all cases in which they do feel a concern, their opinions and feelings have a consideration equal or even superior to that of the other sex. Men had this duty to protect the woman and were the lords of creation, in the words of Thomas R. Drew, the author of The Ideal Southern Woman in 1835. He brings up the term Southern belle or lady as the ideal woman, quiet, not outspoken, but charming, welcoming, and family-oriented. Southern women, in contrast to the North, were typically taught not to talk about certain issues, as Anne Ferrer Scott suggests in her essay, The Southern Lady, From Pedestal to Politics in 1970. During the Civil War era, slave-holding women of the South continued to experience a radicalization of their home sphere. This came in part through their own justification of the very cause of the war, which was slavery. They were also affected by the Industrial Revolution, and goods that they'd previously made themselves were either bought from northern factories or produced by their slaves. Women such as Mary Boykin Chestnut, a slave-holding Southerner during the Civil War, believed that the Northern critique of slavery was unfounded and unjust on the basis of morality and family values. Chestnut believed that Southern women were something of a mother figure to both their slaves and their children, and this widespread viewpoint only highlighted a Southern woman's role, to care for the home and the family. So, essentially, Confederate women increased the strength of the roles that bound them to the home by arguing for the morality of the Confederate cause, which at its core was the continuation of slavery. Historians of the women's rights movement in the 1970s, like Catherine Clinton, have contended that Southern women were somehow victims of the patriarchy they experienced, but according to historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese, elite women internalized the idea of lady and recognized the benefits of race-based slavery to their class. Now the idea of the Civil War as a gender crisis can come into question. Southern women were not as much involved in reform movements because these movements brought slavery into question, and slavery was the basis for their domestic power. Men at the South equated any female reform, even in the North, as a threat to their own male dominance and manhood, an idea perpetuated by Uncle Tom's Cabin, an influential novel written by a woman. Southern women knew that their husbands were having sex with their slaves, and also knew that exposing them would be economically and socially detrimental for their husband as well as them. When Charles Sumner criticized Southerner Andrew Butler in 1851 for sleeping with his slaves, Southerners were outraged, and Sumner was brutally beaten on the floor of Congress by another Southerner. Southern women would seem to gossip about mulattoes around town, but would lie to themselves about a mulatto in their own households. They would blame the slaves for their quote-unquote prostitution. Southern slaveholding men taking advantage of their female slaves in order to produce more slaves was essential for their economic gain. William Harper, in his memoir on slavery in 1853, wrote about how if a prostitute in the North was impregnated, she would be thrown out into the street. However, in the South, slaves served this very purpose for their masters. In Harper's words, her offspring is not a burden but an acquisition to her owner. His support is provided for, and he is brought up to usefulness. If the fruit of intercourse with a freeman, his condition is perhaps raised somewhat above that of his mother. Thus, the Civil War can be perceived as a gender crisis because Southern men felt that the gender spheres producing the anti-slavery and feminist rhetoric seen in the North posed a threat to their manhood and could eventually be spread to the South if secession failed.